I'd like to give a nice warm welcome to Dr. James Wagner, research professor in the Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan Institute for Social Research. James is a survey statistician, and his research is in the areas of responsive or adaptive design, non-response bias, and data quality measures. He also develops and implements responsive design plans on large surveys. And with that, James, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks, Megan. It's great to be here. And this is a great sized group, really. So I'm hoping that it can be really interactive, that there can be lots of interruptions. I think that's very useful for me to kind of redirect off things that are interesting to me to things that might be interesting to you. I wanted to start by just pointing it to the SBE CCC website, where if you look under consulting, you'll find Brady West and I, we work together. We run something called the Statistical Design Group at SRC. All of our contact information is here. So that's why I'm pointing it out, as I think an easy way for this group to reach us. I think we're pretty easy to reach. And we really want to provide that consulting. I'm not just saying that. So I feel like we've been a little underutilized. So we'd be excited if you would reach out to us for a discussion, because that's something that we really like to do. So I'd look forward to hearing from each of you to have that kind of discussion. Today, I'm going to give a short introduction. As I said, it'd be nice to have some interruptions, to have questions and so forth. I'll try to keep an eye on if you put your hand up, if you put in the chat, or if you just want to interrupt me with a group this size. I think all of those are fair game and fine with me, really. So feel free to do that. Let me check the chat real quick and make sure I'm not missing anything. Thanks. So just acknowledging this comes from a research program that Brady and I've directed that was originally funded by an IR25 award listed here, and the staff who've worked with us and helped us develop a website. I'll give you the website at the end of the presentation. It's got a lot of resources related to the things I'm going to talk about today. So if you're interested in those, I'd recommend that. John's already introduced me, so I won't spend a lot of time, but here's my email address. I am a research professor and a faculty member of the Michigan Program in Survey and Data Science. I specialize in the kind of things that John talked about, so I'm happy to talk about sampling issues, non-response, error as it may relate to your particular project, those sorts of things. What I want to do today, though, is give a brief introduction to this concept of responsive survey design. I'm going to give a little bit of background and talk about survey methods, talk about how they relate to other fields of inquiry, and then talk about some of the issues that surveys have faced over the last 20 years as a reason for why we've turned to this set of techniques we call responsive survey design. And then I'm going to look at some basic concepts and definition and end with illustration. And I hope that approach gives you a clear sense of what it is we're trying to do. So I would first want to say that I'm a survey methodologist by training, and I think of that as a scientific field that's worth training, that's worth gaining knowledge in and treating it as an endeavor like many other scientific fields. There is, in fact, a large literature on survey methods, and it's organized around key error sources, sort of non-response, measurement errors, coverage and sampling errors. And we take this perspective that we call the total survey error perspective. It's really a conceptual perspective that guides us as we think about gathering data. And I think that this applies. I was telling Megan, we've developed a Coursera course on the concept of total data quality that relates to many different kinds of data quality. But here I'm mainly focused on survey quality, and we categorize sources of error into two broad categories, measurement and representation, as a way to think about the kind of problems that we can encounter. Now, much of what I'm going to focus on today will relate to non-response error, which you see over here, and the kind of biases that can occur when people decide not to participate in our surveys for various reasons. But this is kind of the governing framework that we use to think about all the potential sources of errors as we approach the problem of gathering data. Now, surveys have faced issues over the last 20 years, and one of the key issues has been increasing non-response, especially in interviewer-administered surveys, and the increasing cost of data collection. And those two things are related to each other, right? So because it's more difficult to get people to participate in surveys, we take more expensive approaches, we do more to try and recruit people, and it increases the costs. Even so, it's been very uncertain processes, right? It's been very difficult to say, predict the response rate, to predict the eligibility rate, to make predictions about the outcomes in terms of costs and outputs. And in an era in which we're increasing the complexity of our designs, where we're doing more to try and recruit persons, all of that leads to more uncertainty in trying to figure out what's the optimal kind of design for any particular problem. And just as a demonstration of this increasing non-response, this is a summary from a very large survey called the National Health Interview Survey that's been run every year. It's continuing to run, but these data just go through 2015, and you can see there's been this trend of increasing non-response over time, particularly since about 2000. There's been a growth of non-response for different reasons that you'll see here, and the growth rates listed on the right-hand side. Just a demonstration of the problem. I'm sure if you've worked on surveys, you've seen this kind of thing over time. Now, it's also the case that there's been increasing costs. Sorry, I'm working with my Zoom controls. Increasing costs, but it's related to that difficulty, right? So we might spend more time trying to get people to participate. We might send them more letters. We might send them more emails. We might offer an incentive. We might do more things that try to recruit them. And those things generally add more costs to what we're trying to do. There's also issues with sampling and mode related factors. That is, many of us have switched to surveys that are conducted in multiple modes. And now each mode has sort of startup costs associated with each of those things. And that increased complexity, increased costs becomes a factor in data collection. You know, I like to end here with this background opportunities, because we often are just looking at these negatives. But in fact, a lot of the positive things have happened in the last 20 years for surveys as well, including computerization, which means we have processes that used to be paper, that used to be decentralized, are now centralized, and the data are often available almost immediately. And those tools that capture that data gives us some options in order to make decisions during the data collection. Makes it easier to change course, to develop new treatments, if you will, to develop new designs that allow us to address some of the quality issues that we're concerned about. And we call these data paradata because they're data about the process of collecting data. And they can come from different sources, including from case management systems, from interviewing software like Qualtrics, or we use a software called Blaze or SurveyMonkey. Those other kinds of data capture softwares also capture data about the process. How long does it take to answer a question? Those sorts of things. And all of that allows for kind of real-time survey management, which I think is the opportunity here. That's the thing, that's the silver lining to our current situation. All right, so that's the background. Increasing non-response, increasing costs, but we also have new technological opportunities. How do those things all come together to create a situation where we want to identify new surveys? Well, the new definition, I think, comes from this responsive survey design technique developed here at University of Michigan by colleagues Bob Groves and Steve Heeringa, who Steve still works here. He's just down the hall from me today. Called responsive survey design. All of those elements came together and they formulated a new kind of design concept, the precepts of which are listed on this slide. I won't spend a lot of time on each of these now because I'm going to be illustrating each of these in more detail in subsequent slides. But the first thing we do is we pre-identify a set of design features that are potentially affecting costs and errors of survey estimates. So we want to know, what are the potential problems that this survey could face? What are the pitfalls? What are the sources of error that we're most concerned about? And then identify a set of indicators for the costs and errors that we are concerned about. And I'll come back to examples of that, so that might sound a little abstract at the moment, but I'll show you some examples of what I mean. Once we have those indicators, we use those to trigger changes in the design. All right, so when one design has ceased to be effective based on our indicator, we switch features of the survey. So that's point C on this slide. And once we've gone through all of those steps, then we need to combine the data together to create a single estimate. And so that's the last step in this procedure. So that's an overview. As I said, I'm going to illustrate each of these and give examples, I think, that'll help make sense of it. The first thing I want to do, though, is just define some terms. And I think that'll help us think through some of these illustrations a little more easily. The first is a design phase, and you'll see that several of these terms are related. So I want to have, across my design phases, I want to have designs that are complementary. And I'll define that in a moment. And I'm also going to talk about the use of experiments in early phases. I'm going to define a term phase capacity, and then talk about how we can use Paradata to help us evaluate phases, to develop indicators that'll help us move from phase to phase. So that's just kind of an overview. A design phase is really, you could think of it as we used to call essential survey conditions. What are the complete set of conditions of a particular design? What are the most important features? So for example, you could think of a sequential mode design where I'm going to start out with a web survey. When I have reached the limit of the web survey's capabilities, then I'm going to turn to another survey, another mode. I'm going to do telephone interviewing, for example. You could think of those as independent phases. They have design features that are different. The essential survey conditions are different. So it's a particular set of design features. It doesn't need to be the mode, and it doesn't need to be a single feature. It could be a set of those features. Now, the features can be sequential. They could also be concurrent, but happening at different timing for each individual in a sample. So there's a phase can be defined at the survey level or at the case level. But let's come back to some examples that might help clarify that concept. The second idea that relates to that phase idea is that we want complementary design features. That is, we want phases that complement each other. So each phase might create errors or biases, but when I put them together, those biases can cancel each other out. So for example, if I have an initial design phase that tends to recruit older persons, but is less successful at recruiting young persons, I might want to have a complementary phase that's better at recruiting young persons and less well recruiting at older persons. And those two features, those two phases then become complementary and cancel the errors out of each other. So we're looking for complementary design features. Now that's an ideal that I'll acknowledge is often difficult to achieve, but that's what we're looking for. Now, we might want to use experiments early on in our survey design in order to test design options so that we can identify complementary features and which set of design features is optimal in that sense of minimizing the errors. And I can use part of the sample to select the preferred set of features, and then the rest of the panel can implement those preferred features. And usually randomized experiments are a good way to figure out which options work best. Phase capacity then, again, related to this idea of phase, is the idea that I'm going to find a stable estimate after a certain amount of time. The phase is going to reach its capacity. It's no longer going to change estimates. When I'm thinking about bias, I want to see, am I recruiting a different kind of person? Am I recruiting more of the same kind of person? If I'm recruiting more of the same kind of person, then I'd say that phase has reached its capacity, and it may be time to see if I can develop an alternative design that will actually recruit a different kind of person that will be complementary in that way I just described a moment ago. So when a phase hits capacity, it says here there's no benefit of additional effort. I'd say that strictly speaking, that's not true. It's maybe hyperbole because, of course, if I'm obtaining more interviews, I'm reducing sampling error, right? I'm increasing my sample size, which is a good thing. But if I'm not addressing, I'm losing an opportunity to address potential biases that result from the current recruitment procedure. So examples of error-sensitive indicators, here I'm just using as an example an R indicator being short for representativity indicator, which measures how well the sample looks like the respondents that I've recruited. Are those two things close? With the idea that I can limit the potential for non-response error if I can make the ones that I've recruited, the cases that I've recruited, similar to the sample characteristics. And this R indicator gives me a way to measure that difference. And technically, it's just 1 minus 2 times the standard deviation of an estimated response propensity, right? So I'm using a model to estimate those response propensities. It's just a logistic regression model. And it's important, the set of predictors that I put into that model, but the measure itself gives me a way to say how far apart is my respondent set from my sample set. higher values indicating that the respondent characteristics are closer to the sample characteristics. And it's a proxy for non-response bias. We did a little empirical study where we looked at if this indicator goes up, does non-response bias tend to go down? And the answer was yes. So putting that all together, this map taken from the original paper shows a way that we can kind of conceptualize all of these pieces, all of these notions fitting together into a single way of designing surveys. So I've got multiple phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. In phase 1, I'm experimentally testing a set of design options. And then I make a decision. I choose a design option S for phase 2. And then I try to identify that complementary design option for phase 3 that's going to limit the biases, that's going to mitigate the biases produced by my design from phase 2. I'm going to combine everything together then in order to make estimates at the end. So that's kind of a broad stroke approach, definition of terms, and overview. Now, I tend to focus on non-response error, but I want to point out that we could also use these methods to attack other sources of error. So I'll just make that note here. I'm going to pause for a second before I jump into illustrations because I feel like I've been going really fast. Maybe I just need to catch my breath, but I also want to give you a chance to jump in with a question or a comment.
James?
Yeah.
Has this been applied to any non-probability sample collection, like no frame to start?
Yeah, Ashwan, good question. Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, I'm doing one. I will ask for
Yeah.
opinion later. Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about that later. That'd be interesting for me because I would want to measure against the, you'd be the expert in this, Yashwan, but I'd want to measure the characteristics of the population to see how carefully that probability sample comes close to that, right? Just starting from the idea of an error indicator. But yeah, I'd love to talk to you more about that, Yashwan.
Thank you.
Okay, yep, thank you. So just thinking about some illustrations. The first thing I want to say is really you should think about key objectives before starting, right? Because I usually start from this big perspective of total survey error, but many of those errors can't be measured directly. And so I have to kind of make some priorities. I have to make some choices about what I think are the most important objectives. Maybe I'm most concerned about non-response error. Maybe I'm most concerned about controlling costs. Maybe I'm most concerned about getting the largest sample size possible. I have to make all of those choices early on to help guide the key objectives to make me focus on what's going to be a priority for any particular data collection, and then think about each of those steps for implementing. So I think I call that first step, step 0, right? Because it's not in Groves and Heeringa, but I generally recommend that kind of approach. So if you're like us, like we do a lot of contract data collection, then we would be looking for the person sponsoring the data collection to give us the objective, to tell us what's most important to them. For people in this consortium, I think you're really thinking about what's the risk that you are most concerned about limiting in your data collection, and make that explicit as a kind of a first step exercise. Now I'm going to use some illustrations here, and I've tried to draw useful illustrations. So some surveys that I look at here are going to be large. Some of them are going to be smaller surveys. I have more examples that are included in the slides, or you go to our website, you can see more examples. We just published a paper that looks at small scale surveys, for example. So I have other examples. Maybe that's something you can press me on. But the examples that I chose, one of them is a survey that I worked on for a long time called the National Survey of Family Growth. It had a continuous design that was, we released a sample every quarter. So that gave us a way to replicate procedures and kind of tune them over time. It had a 2-stage collection where we identified eligible persons through a screening process, and then we gave them an interview of about 60 to 80 minutes, which focuses on fertility, family formation, and so forth. And there's 2 phases of data collection. So I've already talked about phases. But the second phase changes things by subsampling cases and creating smaller workloads for interviewers, changing the incentive, and then adding some new features into the second phase, including a prepaid incentive, which was only available in that phase. So there's a number of changes that produce a different design, and there are several papers that look at estimates that how are the estimates affected by this procedure? Is that second phase complementary? And I think we can demonstrate that it was. The second survey that I'm going to look at is called the Relationship Dynamics and Social Life Survey that was conducted here. It was a survey of 18 and 19-year-old women. There's a citation if you're interested, in a county in Michigan where they did weekly journals, right? So they wanted to ask these young women every 7 to 14 days about experiences they might have had over the last 7 to 14 days. And it was a short survey, 3 to 5 minutes every week, but it was capturing important behaviors. And the idea was to capture these prospectively. So they followed people for 2.5 years. They followed young women for 2.5 years. And they had a face-to-face recruitment, but the idea was they'd mostly be on web, but they also added telephone as a way to promote participation and prevent people from falling out of the survey. And I'll show some of the impact of that as part of the illustration. So again, back to this idea that I think the first step, that step 0, is thinking about what are the areas of uncertainty. Step 1 of the responsive survey design, identify the areas of uncertainty and think about what are the risks that this project is facing. Is it the response rate? Is it the threat of non-response bias? Is it the threat of high cost? And thinking about what estimates in your survey design actually have uncertainty, right? So if you've planned a survey, you've maybe used a spreadsheet, you've maybe used some kind of algorithm to help you decide what's the sample size you need in order to hit a targeted response rate. What is that targeted response rate? And answering those kind of questions can be difficult. And thinking about which of those parameters has the most uncertainty is often a good way to identify potential issues. It might lead you to raise questions about sampling error. Am I going to attain the power that I hope that I designed this study for if I don't get the sample size that I expected? Is the population more variable than I expected? So thinking about those things ahead of time then will allow us to go to the next step, which is how do I think about indicators for each of these errors, these potential sources of error? How do I protect myself by identifying potential indicators? So just to take that RDSL example, the risk, the uncertainty that we thought about ahead of time was just both really related to attrition, but different kinds of attrition. The first was that people might not complete their journals every week. And one of the things that this study tried to explore was if we look at a prospective analysis of different kinds of behavior, including use of contraception, sexual activity, can we get better data than if we ask people about their behaviors over the last 2.5 years, let's say, or a year even. So the idea is we wanted reporting only on the last 2 weeks. So if somebody didn't fill out their journal for 2 weeks, we missed data. Then we're missing data. It would be a problem. There'd be gaps. And I actually spent a lot of time figuring out how do we fill in those gaps. So the idea was, what do we do to keep people participating? The other risk was that people would drop out over time. Like it's 2.5 years. That's a long period of time. How do we address that? How do we keep people involved and interested? So these were two of the areas of uncertainty that we thought of as we were beginning to design the survey. So the next step then, after thinking about these areas of uncertainty, is to define some indicators that help us monitor those. Now, here I'm looking at from the survey, that NSFG that I talked about a minute ago, I'm looking at a cost indicator, right? So I want to know, are the costs expected to be out of line? Now here, this figure isn't looking at dollars. It's not looking at expenditures in real dollars. It's looking at expenditures of effort. It's saying, how many calls per hour are interviewers able to make over this time frame of this quarterly survey? Right, so it's giving us some sense, are interviewers being efficient? Is the sample efficient? Is there some efficiency or cost problem that we should be aware of? And we're monitoring these in real time to see if something is developing. So it's a kind of indicator for cost. But you may also be interested in indicators for other areas, including non-response. So for non-response error, some typical indicators might be the response rate or the R indicator, the indicator that I showed earlier. Proxy Y indicators. So are there variables that you can have on your sampling frame that are similar to things that you're going to collect, or even just predictive of things you're going to collect, and can monitoring those help you? Another approach that people sometimes take is looking at changes in estimate, that is, do the early responders or responders in a later phase look different from responders in an early phase? So those are some kind of indicators that people have used in these situations. Now, here's an example from that NSFG survey that I talked about a minute ago, where interviewers judged whether or not respondents were sexually active, right? They made an observation about this characteristic so that we had it for respondents and non-respondents. And then we monitored to see the difference between respondents and non-respondents on a daily basis to see if it ever got to be too large. We might want to recruit persons who were underrepresented with respect to that characteristic. And our rule was, if the difference ever became statistically significant, then we would intervene to equalize response rates across the two groups. So we're monitoring this on a daily basis. It's an indicator, and we have an intervention plan in case we see an imbalance developing. I'm jumping a little ahead to interventions, but here's the monitoring tool that helped us and the indicator that helped us keep track of that condition. So that next step that I jumped ahead to a little bit is to develop interventions. And I'd say there's two components to an intervention. The first thing you think about is, what am I going to do? In fact, the first part of the intervention really is a rule specifying when to implement it. So for instance, if a subgroup response rate is more than X% below the next lowest group, then I should take the action. I should intervene in some way. Okay, so I've already sort of given you an example of that, where I'm going to intervene to improve response rates in that group, the lower responding group. So two components to an intervention: the rule that specifies when it should be implemented, and then the plan design change. And so here you can think of this rule has something to do with the phase capacity, and the design change, I want it to be complementary, right? So if I'm starting to experience some imbalance in errors, I may want to implement a design change that's going to address that by being complementary to the previous set of design features. As I just said, the timing coincides with boundaries defined by phase capacity. So I've reached some kind of imbalance. I'm not recruiting different kinds of persons. I continue to have sort of similar patterns in my recruitment. Now I'm looking for a complementary design feature that's going to help me address the imbalances that my recruitment procedure has created. So let me give you this example. I'm going to go back to that relationship dynamics survey, RDSL. We allowed multiple modes of completion, so web and telephone, but we needed a rule that would tell us when are we going to intervene, right? When's our intervention need to be implemented? So we considered a respondent late after 2 weeks. Now, that was our recall period. When we set the survey up, we asked them to respond every week, thinking, yeah, if you start this pattern, if you respond on a Sunday, you'll respond again on the next Sunday, and so forth and so forth. We were hoping to create patterns that would induce response, but we knew that some people would miss, and we needed a strategy in place to improve response to this journal. So there was a follow-up with email and text message after they missed that first weekly journal. Then there was a second follow-up 4 to 9 days later with telephone calls. But we also allowed people to complete the diary over the telephone to give an alternate mode for completion. Might have been easier than using the web on a weekly basis, for example. Now, we published a paper, the citation here, with a colleague, Bill X and Heather Gatney and myself. We looked at what were the outcomes, what were the results of the fact that we allowed multiple modes. And this table is just showing the difference between respondents who always use the same mode for a journal, and for the journal, mostly web, and those who gave at least responses in at least 2 modes, basically. you'll see a large proportion, this is almost 1,000 respondents, and 443 of those actually use these multiple mode options. And in fact, on all of these characteristics, some of which are derived from those journals, did they ever have sex without contraception, for example, that there are differences between those who were able to respond because we offered them multiple modes and those who always respond in a single mode. So it's not the same thing as not allowing people to participate in multiple modes, but it does give us some sense of the impact of having this design feature and its complementary nature to the other option, which was just a single mode design.
Whenever
Yeah.
people use this data, do they then have to control for how people took it? Like, is there an indicator in the data set that says how people took that particular wave or journal?
Yeah, I think each journal, so I can't remember the total number of journals. It's 1,000 women and it's 30 months. So that's like 140 weeks, something like 140 weeks, right?
Yeah.
So I can't do the math in my head, but that's a lot of journals. But yeah, I believe there's the data set that I use has that variable, right? So what journal mode was used, telephone versus web. Yeah. So, Claire, your comment does point to the fact that there could be mode differences in response as well.
Yeah.
We're not
Yeah.
accounting for that here. We're just saying it looks like there's a difference, could be selectivity, right? Right. So that in fact, people whose lives are more complicated need multiple modes in order to respond. If we force people to respond in only one way, we may limit participation to only certain kinds of people. And
I think
that's
this is
sort of the
very
point of this
compelling.
paper. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very
Well,
compelling
thanks.
because a lot of a lot of places that collect data for people don't have interviewers anymore because people don't answer their phones as much. So a lot of times your only option to collect your data is online. So this is very interesting to me, that just in thinking about for people that are trying to determine who's going to collect their data, the fact that the ones that were able to switch mode had more, variability and maybe more risk. That's like a really important point that I don't think we talk enough about.
Thanks, Claire. I'll say more about that because we just came out with this paper, Sociological Methods in Research. I think Bill Hexon, again, is the lead author on that paper, and it's called Responsive Survey Design for Small-Scale Surveys. We did a series of campus surveys. That paper is based on one that we did in 2017, I think. So we're sampling students. I'm trying to remember, I think it was just students in that survey. We didn't offer participation other than through the web, but we did use interviewers to contact and promote participation. And one thing that we found when we talked to students was that graduate students typically misunderstood the survey as not being for them. They didn't think of themselves as students. This isn't 100% of graduate students, right? But there was a significant fraction of graduate students for whom they thought the survey was not for them. And our direct contact allowed us to answer that question for them. So I think interviewers are expensive. That's the main reason why many places have gone away from using interviewers. But even a simple approach like that, where we use contacts to promote participation, which can be significantly less expensive, can help a lot. And we're working on another set of experiments. I think we had some results published in a Journal of Survey Statistics and Methodology, where we took a similar approach. Mail web survey, relatively inexpensive, but we used a small number of contacts by telephone to ask participation, to promote participation in the survey. And we found that that was a very powerful tool. So we have a paper on that topic. Thanks. So then the last step for us is always to evaluate and document. And I don't know, lessons learned. This is the easiest easiest step to skip in any project, but generally one of the more valuable ones. And for us, a big thing is replicability. So, we've been spending a lot of time building indicators that are replicable, to create decision rules that are replicable, using Bayesian methods. And so we've spent a lot of time on that in recent years, because I think this replicability thing is important. And we want to find ways to make what we've managed to accomplish across a wide range of surveys replicable in other settings. And it's another reason to reach out to us, because we really do mean it when we said we love to be consultants on projects and provide this kind of consultation. So I'm at a summary stage. I do have some other slides to show other examples if you'd like. So responsive survey design arose in the face of uncertainty and trying to deal with uncertainties in design. The opportunity really was that computerization allowed us to intervene in real time, to collect data in real time, to understand what's happening in real time, and then intervene in real time. And that responsive design then is a pre-planned set of features. So that intervention has a rule. That rule is based on an indicator, and then we intervene based on that indicator. That gives us a framework for optimizing decisions and improving over time. I think as we implement these procedures, we can improve over time and make it replicable so that others can take those procedures and get similar results or better. So that's the end of my talk. I have some other slides if I can give other examples, but if I can answer questions, that's good too. I'm pointing here to our website because we have a number of things there that are useful. I think, Claire, we have some citations about some of the things that I've been talking about that aren't in my slides today, some of the things that I've mentioned. We have this responsive design education program that we run through our summer institute that we offer courses in this kind of thing. And I'll leave it there. There's my contact information if you'd like to email me directly.